When an arrogant billionaire rules everyone through fear, no one dares to speak up, until the maid's son, with an unexpected gesture, exposes his deepest pain and leaves him in tears before them all. Before we continue, subscribe now to the channel to receive powerful stories every day that touch the heart. In the heart of Manhattan, inside the luxurious Grand Empire Hotel ballroom, the night glowed with crystal chandeliers casting golden light across tables where businessmen, politicians, and celebrities toasted with polished elegance. At the center of it all stood Victor Ellison, a 52-year-old billionaire known for his arrogance and for humiliating anyone who dared to speak out of turn. No one dared address him without being invited. His reputation for cruelty kept even the boldest tongues tied. The silence surrounding him was not respect, it was fear. Among hurried waiters and discreet staff walked Liam Miller, a 14-year-old boy in an oversized uniform, the son of Sarah Miller, the maid who had served the Ellison family for years. Liam moved unnoticed, carrying trays and avoiding the gaze of the elite. But that night his heart beat differently. Something inside him whispered that this would not be just another evening of invisibility. As Victor's sharp words drew forced laughter from the room, Liam's eyes locked onto the man with a mixture of sorrow and courage. His chest tightened, his fists clenched, and in that moment he knew he could no longer remain silent. With a sudden resolve, Liam straightened his back and stepped forward, his small figure illuminated by the glow of the chandeliers. Glasses stilled, conversations froze, and the air grew tense. In a single heartbeat, the boy made a choice no one else in that hall had dared: to speak to the arrogant millionaire in front of them all. And nothing would ever be the same again. The Grand Empire Hotel shimmered like a palace of glass and steel, its ballroom a stage of power where fortunes were displayed as effortlessly as the crystal chandeliers above. At the heart of the gathering sat Victor Ellison, 52 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a perfectly tailored navy suit that seemed to weigh as much as his pride. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back with precision, and his piercing gray eyes carried the sharpness of a man who had crushed every rival that dared stand in his way. He was the kind of man whose mere presence bent conversations around him, and yet it wasn't respect that kept people silent, it was fear. Guests whispered only when he allowed it, laughed when he smirked, and froze at the mere arch of his brow. He was the embodiment of arrogance, a fortress no one dared to breach. On the edges of that glittering room, Liam Miller moved quietly, balancing a tray of empty glasses with hands still too small for the weight of the crystal. Only 14 years old, his uniform was too large for his slender frame, the sleeves of his white shirt folded up clumsily by his mother that morning before he left with her for the hotel. His brown hair fell slightly into his eyes, and his expression carried both the innocence of youth and the heaviness of a boy who had seen too much silence. He wasn't a guest, not even a waiter. He was simply the maid's son, invisible to everyone except his mother. But his eyes, curious and restless, never stopped moving, catching details no one else bothered to see. To Liam, the world of wealth was not glamorous. It was a gilded cage that suffocated anyone who dared to breathe too loudly. Beside him, in the distance, his mother Sarah Miller worked tirelessly, her posture modest, her movements precise, always making herself smaller than she was so as not to disturb the empire she served. For years she had endured Victor's condescending glances, the sharp orders of his assistants, and the cold dismissal of those who treated her as nothing more than a shadow in the grand house. Yet, despite her sacrifices, she carried a quiet strength, the kind only a mother could wear, an unspoken determination to shield her son from the cruelty of the powerful. That night, However, she noticed something unusual in Liam's gaze. He wasn't shrinking into the background like he usually did. His eyes were fixed on Victor Ellison with a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. Sarah's heart tightened. She knew her son well enough to understand that something was about to happen, something that could change everything. Victor Ellison's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, smooth yet dripping with disdain. As he raised his glass for a toast, his words weren't to honor his guests, but to belittle them. "Without me," he said, his tone carrying the certainty of a king addressing peasants, "none of you would even be here tonight. This empire exists because I built it from nothing, and don't you forget it." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, forced and hollow, as though everyone feared the consequences of silence. No one dared challenge him. Not the executives who depended on his fortune, not the politicians who relied on his influence, not even the guests who secretly despised him. Victor thrived on that fear, feeding off the submission in their eyes. To him, domination was power, and power was everything. From the corner of the room, Liam watched in quiet disbelief. His chest tightened as he saw adults twice, even 3 times his age, bowing their heads like children scolded in class. The boy had grown used to arrogance in the mansion where his mother worked, but here it was magnified, painted in gold and crystal. He could see how people pretended to laugh, how their hands trembled as they lifted their glasses, how their smiles disappeared the second Victor turned his gaze away. To everyone else, Victor was untouchable, but to Liam, he looked like a man desperately clutching a throne built on fear. And though he was only 14, Liam could sense something no one else dared to see. Beneath the arrogance, Victor carried a wound too deep to hide forever. Sarah Miller kept her eyes down, polishing a silver tray with quiet diligence, but her ears caught every word. She had endured years of Victor's coldness, years of cleaning rooms filled with trophies that celebrated his wealth but hid his emptiness. She wanted nothing more than to protect Liam from that toxicity, to teach him humility in the face of cruelty. But when she glanced at her son, she noticed the fire burning in his expression. Liam wasn't intimidated by the laughter or the silence. He wasn't shrinking as she always feared he might. Instead, he looked as if he was waiting for the right moment to step into the light. Sarah's hands trembled around the tray, her mother's instinct screaming that the boy was on the verge of doing something no one else dared. Something dangerous. Something that could change their lives forever. The ballroom shimmered with light, yet for Liam it felt suffocating, as if the chandeliers themselves pressed down on his small shoulders. Everywhere he turned, he saw people trapped in cages of their own making. Polished shoes rooted to the marble floor, expensive dresses wrapped in invisible chains. No one dared to breathe too loudly. No one dared to speak a word that Victor Ellison had not granted them permission to say. This wasn't a celebration. It was submission disguised as glamour. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, the kind of silence that screams louder than words. Liam felt it in his bones. He could taste it on his tongue. It was the silence his mother lived under every day, the silence of the powerless beneath the shadow of the powerful. Sarah Miller knew this silence better than anyone. For years, she had kept her head low, cleaning up the fragments of Victor's world, never daring to challenge the hand that paid her wages and determined her roof. She told herself she did it for Liam, that enduring humiliation was worth it if her son could at least eat and study. But watching him tonight, she realized the silence that protected her had also suffocated him. Liam's restless eyes betrayed the truth. He was tired of being invisible, tired of watching injustice dressed in a suit of silk. Sarah's heart ached, because she understood something her son had yet to learn. Breaking silence always comes with a cost. Liam's young mind carried memories too heavy for his age. He remembered overhearing whispers in the Ellison mansion, fragments of conversations not meant for the ears of a maid's son. He remembered his mother's tears late at night, the way she pressed her hand over her mouth so her sobs wouldn't wake him. And he remembered a photo in the Ellison hallway, a photo of a child no one dared to talk about, a photo Victor kept but never acknowledged. To everyone else, silence meant survival. But to Liam, silence meant complicity. And as he stood among people who bowed to arrogance, he made a decision deep inside his heart. He would not remain quiet, not tonight. Victor Ellison's words echoed once more, sharp and deliberate, as he raised his glass toward the glittering crowd. "You should all be grateful," he declared, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Without my empire, most of you would be nothing but shadows." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread across the ballroom, guests forcing smiles as though their very survival depended on appeasing him. For a moment, the orchestra faltered, a violin note trembling as if even the musicians were afraid to play too loudly in his presence. The air was thick, stifling, filled with the unspoken rule that no one dared to break. But amid that suffocating silence, a boy's heart began to pound harder than the music. Liam Miller stood frozen, gripping the tray in his hands until his knuckles turned white, his young face burning with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He thought of his mother, of the years she had given her strength and dignity to this man who saw her as little more than furniture in his mansion. He thought of the photograph on the Ellison wall, a child's face preserved in gold but never spoken of, a relic surrounded by secrets. He thought of the way Victor's words crushed everyone in the room, bending them into silence as if their lives were nothing more than coins in his pocket. Liam felt something rise inside him, a storm too powerful for a 14-year-old boy to hold back. His lips pressed together, his chest heaved, and he realized he couldn't bear another second of this charade. He didn't want to live in a world where arrogance reigned unchallenged. His heart told him he had to do what no one else dared. Then, without planning, without permission, Liam acted. The tray slipped from his trembling hands, crashing onto the marble floor, the sharp sound slicing through the suffocating air like a lightning bolt. Glass shattered, silverware clattered, and the entire ballroom froze in shock. Heads turned in unison, conversations cut off mid-sentence, and even Victor Ellison's smirk faltered as he shifted his gaze toward the boy who had dared disturb his kingdom of silence. For a heartbeat, all eyes locked on Liam, small, vulnerable, but standing tall in his defiance. His chest rose and fell, his breath shallow, but his eyes did not waver. In that suspended moment, the impossible had happened. The unspoken rule of fear had been broken, and it wasn't by a politician, an investor, or a rival. It was by the son of a maid. The sound of shattering glass still rang in the silence, like an uninvited drumbeat in Victor Ellison's empire of order. The waiters froze. The orchestra halted mid-note, and every guest turned as one to witness the fragile boy who had dared to disturb the night. Liam Miller's small frame seemed to tremble under the weight of hundreds of eyes, yet his gaze never dropped. Victor's lips curled into a mocking smile, the kind that had destroyed seasoned businessmen and humiliated servants alike. "What is this?" he sneered, his voice sharp as glass. "A child who doesn't know his place?" The words cut the air like a whip, but Liam, breathing fast, clenched his fists and stepped forward. He wasn't going to disappear into the shadows. Not tonight. The boy's voice was soft at first, but it carried through the ballroom with an honesty that no microphone could amplify. "Mr. Ellison," Liam said, his tone steadying with each syllable, "I need to tell you something." Gasps rippled through the crowd. guests exchanging nervous glances as though expecting the boy to be dragged out any second. Victor's brow furrowed, more annoyed than threatened, but something in Liam's eyes held him still. Something raw, something real. And before anyone could intervene, the boy reached into the pocket of his oversized uniform and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hand shook as he raised it, not from weakness, but from the gravity of what he was about to reveal. It wasn't just a slip of paper. It was a secret waiting to explode. For a heartbeat, Victor's composure cracked. His eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Liam, as if recognizing the shape of a ghost he had tried to bury. The guests leaned in, curiosity overpowering their fear, their champagne forgotten. Liam unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately, his fingers trembling as though unveiling forbidden scripture. "I found this," he said, his voice gaining strength, "and I think it belongs to you." The silence grew suffocating, yet no one dared move. Even Sarah, standing frozen across the room, felt her breath catch in her throat, tears already welling in her eyes. She knew that note. She had hidden it, guarded it, and now her son was placing it into the light of 100 eyes. The boy's act wasn't just unexpected, it was irreversible. The folded paper trembled in Liam's hands as though it carried the weight of 1,000 unshed tears. Guests leaned forward in their seats, curiosity battling with fear, while Victor Ellison's smile faltered for the first time that evening. His sharp, gray eyes narrowed, but there was no mistaking the flicker of recognition. That note wasn't foreign to him. It was a fragment of a memory he had buried deep in silence, a ghost he had sworn no one would ever unearth. Liam, unaware of the storm he had unleashed, took a deep breath and began to read. His voice, though young and unpolished, filled every corner of the ballroom. "One day, I hope you'll be proud of me, Dad." The words landed like thunder. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd, echoing off the marble walls. The empire of silence was crumbling, word by word. Victor's mask of arrogance cracked. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides, but his eyes betrayed him. They glistened. For decades, he had ruled through fear, sealing his pain behind steel and glass, convincing the world he was invincible. But now, in front of investors, politicians, and every soul who worshipped his wealth, his most intimate wound had been spoken aloud by a boy no one had ever noticed. He wanted to roar, to crush the child who dared to expose him, but he couldn't. The note was too real, the handwriting too familiar, and the truth that he once had a son whose memory he had erased from public life burned like fire in his chest. He felt the ground beneath his empire tremble, and for the first time in years, Victor Ellison couldn't control the room. Liam lowered the paper slowly, his young face pale but resolute. The room was frozen in disbelief, but his eyes were locked on Victor, unafraid. "I saw this note in the mansion," Liam said, his voice steady despite the storm around him. "I don't know why you hid it, but I know what it means. It means you once cared about something more than money." The crowd murmured, confusion and whispers rippling like waves across the golden hall. Sarah Miller pressed her hand against her mouth, her heart pounding so violently it hurt. She knew this moment was dangerous. Victor would never forgive such exposure. But she also knew her son had spoken the words no one else dared. And in that fragile silence, the image of a lost child hovered over the room, haunting every corner of Victor's empire. For a long moment, the ballroom seemed suspended in time. The folded paper still lingered in Liam's small hand, but the words he had spoken echoed louder than the orchestra ever could. Victor Ellison rose from his chair with a suddenness that made glasses tremble and guests flinch. His tall frame loomed over the boy like a storm about to break. "Enough," he thundered, his voice heavy with both fury and fear. The crowd held its breath, unsure whether they were about to witness a child's humiliation or the unraveling of a man they had long worshipped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint clink of a forgotten champagne flute rolling across the marble floor. Victor's face was a mask of rage, but behind his eyes, something deeper flickered: panic. He wanted to snatch the paper, to tear it into shreds before anyone else could read the fragile truth written there. Yet Liam stood firm, clutching it with trembling fingers, refusing to let go. "Where did you get this?" Victor demanded, his voice lowered now, sharp and venomous, meant only for the boy's ears but loud enough for everyone to hear. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the child was holding a piece of the billionaire's soul in his hand. Some of them whispered, others stared in fascination, as though they were watching a lion cornered for the first time in its life. And then, before anyone could move, Liam's other hand emerged from his pocket. He held up not only the note, but a small photograph folded in half, yellowed at the edges. His voice cracked, yet his courage did not falter. "I found this too." The guests gasped again, and Sarah felt her knees weaken as she realized what her son had revealed. Victor's expression froze, his fury caught between denial and despair. The paper could be denied, dismissed as a lie, but the photo was undeniable. It was the one thing he had hidden away, the one memory he had forbidden anyone to speak of. And in that instant, with the crowd leaning forward in anxious anticipation, the empire of Victor Ellison teetered on the edge of collapse. The cliffhanger was set, and everyone knew the next word could change everything. Liam's fingers trembled as he unfolded the photograph with care, revealing an image no one in that glittering hall had ever seen. The picture was simple: an 8-year-old boy smiling awkwardly, holding a baseball glove too big for his hand. The child's eyes shone with innocence, but what caught the crowd's attention wasn't the boy, it was the man beside him. A much younger Victor Ellison, his arm draped proudly over the child's shoulder, his expression softer than anyone in the room believed possible. A ripple of disbelief spread across the ballroom. Could it be true? The ruthless billionaire once had a side of tenderness, a side capable of love. The photograph spoke louder than any words Liam could have uttered. Clutching the note in his other hand, Liam's voice grew stronger, echoing in the silence. "This isn't just paper," he said. "It's a promise. A child wrote this to you, Mr. Ellison. A child who believed one day you'd be proud of him." His words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. The audience shifted, murmurs spreading like wildfire as the weight of the revelation sank in. Investors whispered to each other, journalists scribbled frantically in notebooks, and guests stared at Victor with wide eyes, desperate to see how the titan of steel and glass would respond. Victor, usually composed and immovable, stood frozen, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, his empire of arrogance trembled. His gray eyes, once sharp as blades, glistened with unshed tears. The sight alone silenced the whispers, for no one had ever seen Victor Ellison break. He pressed a hand against the table as though steadying himself, his knuckles white against the polished wood. The powerful man who mocked weakness now stood on the edge of it, exposed before everyone. Liam lowered the photograph slowly, his young face both defiant and compassionate. "Even the strongest men," he said softly, "can't bury love forever." The words struck like lightning, and the audience erupted, not in applause, not in laughter, but in stunned silence, as if the entire ballroom had been pulled into a single heartbeat of truth. Victor Ellison stood frozen, his chest heaving as though the air itself had betrayed him. For years, He had built a fortress of pride so high that not even whispers of the past could reach him. He surrounded himself with glass towers, contracts, and power, but none of it could shield him now from a boy's trembling voice. The photograph burned in his vision. The note echoed in his ears. His carefully crafted mask of dominance was cracking before an audience of hundreds, and no amount of arrogance could hold it together. His lips quivered as he tried to speak, but the only sound that escaped was a shallow breath that revealed the man beneath the legend was still human, fragile, wounded, and haunted. The crowd leaned in, sensing history unfolding before them. They had come to this gala expecting displays of wealth, sharp speeches, and another night of Victor's untouchable arrogance. Instead, they were witnessing the unraveling of a myth. Some guests covered their mouths, astonished, while others dared to exchange glances, questioning how much they truly knew about the man they feared. A billionaire reduced to silence by the words of a child was not something they could ever have imagined. And yet, here it was, undeniable, raw. Even the orchestra remained frozen, instruments hanging midair as if afraid that a single note might shatter the fragile moment further. Victor finally turned his gaze toward Liam, and for the first time, his eyes didn't carry disdain, they carried pain. His voice was low, hoarse, almost broken. How do you know this? The question wasn't just for the boy. It was a plea thrown into the universe, as though begging for an answer to why fate had dragged his secret into the light. Liam didn't flinch. He lifted his chin, his young face pale but determined, and said simply, "Because the truth always finds a way out." The words hung heavy in the air, and in that instant, Victor's empire of power and pride began to crumble, not through lawsuits or rivals, but through the tears he could no longer hold back. The unthinkable had happened. The arrogant millionaire was trembling on the edge of his own humanity. Victor's chest rose and fell like a man drowning in his own past. The moment of vulnerability, those few seconds when tears had threatened to fall, vanished behind a storm of fury. His hand slammed against the table with a thunderous crack that made the chandeliers tremble. "Enough!" he roared, his voice reverberating through the golden ballroom. The crowd flinched, startled, their eyes darting between the trembling boy and the enraged billionaire. Victor's composure was gone. The titan who once towered over New York like an untouchable monument now looked like a cornered animal, raw and unrestrained. The security guards moved instantly, their black suits slicing through the crowd as they rushed toward Liam. Gasps erupted as the boy's small frame seemed to vanish under the shadow of the towering men. But before they could touch him, Victor raised a trembling hand, halting them. His fury was no longer about control, it was personal. He stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing on the marble floor, every stride dripping with menace. His voice dropped to a chilling whisper, audible enough for the audience. "Where did you get this? Who gave you the right to speak of things you don't understand?" His words weren't questions. They were daggers meant to cut Liam down before the eyes of everyone present. But Liam didn't cower. His hands still shook, but his eyes held steady, fixed on the man towering over him. "I found it," he said firmly, his voice carrying more strength than his small body should have had. "In your mansion, hidden, but not forgotten." A murmur spread through the crowd, shock and disbelief colliding in a wave of tension. Victor's face darkened, a mixture of rage and something dangerously close to fear. To be defied in private was one thing, but here, in front of investors, allies, and rivals, it was humiliation. Every second that Liam stood his ground stripped away another layer of Victor's authority. His empire wasn't being attacked from the outside. It was being dismantled by a boy, the son of a maid, armed with nothing but truth. and that humiliation cut deeper than any rival ever could. The ballroom had become a theater of silence, every guest holding their breath as Victor Ellison loomed over Liam. The boy's defiance had stunned them all, but what came next was even more unexpected. From the back of the hall, Sarah Miller stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she clutched the silver tray she had been polishing, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. She had spent years fading into the background, obeying the invisible rule that servants never spoke in the world of the powerful. But tonight, she saw her son standing alone, facing the wrath of a man feared by an entire city. She could not remain silent any longer. "It was me," she said, her voice breaking but clear enough to cut through the air. The words echoed louder than any applause could have. Every head turned toward her. Sarah's face was pale, but her eyes glistened with a mixture of fear and courage. She stepped closer, her voice trembling yet determined. "I found the note years ago," she admitted, her hands clutching the tray as though it might steady her. "I was cleaning the old storage room in the mansion when I saw it tucked between boxes. I thought it was just a forgotten piece of paper, but when I read it, I knew it was more than that. I knew it was something you wanted hidden." Her confession rippled through the crowd, sending whispers like sparks through dry grass. Guests leaned forward, hungry for the truth. The image of loyalty and control Victor had built was unraveling, thread by thread, by the very people he believed invisible. Victor's eyes locked on Sarah, burning with rage, but beneath the fire there was a glimmer of something else, shame. His lips tightened, his fists clenched, but he didn't interrupt her. He couldn't. The damage was already done. Sarah's voice grew steadier as she continued. "I never meant for Liam to find it. I wanted to protect him, to protect us. But the truth has a way of showing itself. And tonight it did." Her words hung heavy in the air, undeniable, undeniable. The guests were no longer just watching a scandal. They were watching history unfold, a titan of arrogance being brought to his knees not by rivals or scandals, but by the courage of a boy and the honesty of a mother. And the question lingered in every mind. If Victor had hidden this truth for so long, what else had he buried beneath his empire? The silence in the ballroom was crushing, heavier than the golden chandeliers hanging above. Victor Ellison stood motionless, his imposing figure suddenly fragile under the weight of revelations he had tried to bury. His empire had been built on intimidation, on the careful erasure of weakness, but now two voices, the trembling yet steady voice of a mother and the fearless courage of a boy, had pierced through his armor. Liam, his hands still clutching the note and photograph, stepped forward once more. His brown eyes locked on Victor's, unwavering, unafraid. "You pretend to be invincible," he said, his young voice cutting like a blade. "But deep down, you're still the man who lost someone he loved. You hide behind power, but you can't hide from your own heart." The words rang out like a verdict, each syllable unraveling the myth of the untouchable millionaire. The crowd gasped, the atmosphere thick with tension. Some guests looked away, uncomfortable at the sight of a boy exposing a man's most private wound. Others leaned in, transfixed, unable to tear their eyes away from the spectacle. Victor's face flushed crimson, his jaw tightening, as though he could crush the words by sheer force of will. Yet he couldn't deny them. Not this time. His eyes glistened, betraying the tears he had fought for years to suppress. It was a sight so shocking that the audience forgot to breathe. This was no longer a gala, it was a reckoning. And standing at the center of it was a 14-year-old boy, holding nothing but the truth, dismantling an empire of arrogance with each word. Sarah's heart ached as she watched her son speak with a strength far beyond his years. She wanted to rush forward, to shield him from the storm she knew was coming, but something stopped her. This was Liam's moment, his voice breaking the silence she had endured her whole life. She saw the ripple of change in the crowd, saw the way some guests nodded with quiet approval while others stared at Victor with newfound doubt. Liam's words weren't just for the man towering above him. They were for everyone present. They reminded each person in that ballroom that arrogance was nothing but a fragile mask, and that even the richest, most powerful man could be undone by the simplest, purest weapon of all, the truth. Victor Ellison's chest heaved, his fists trembling at his sides as though trying to hold together the fortress of arrogance he had built his entire life. The words of the boy echoed relentlessly in his mind. You can't hide from your own heart. He wanted to shout, to deny, to crush the child's audacity with the sheer force of his authority, but his voice failed him. His throat tightened, and his vision blurred. Before hundreds of witnesses, the man who had mocked tears as weakness now felt them burning hot against his eyelids. He pressed a hand to his face, trying to shield himself, but it was too late. The world had already seen it. The unbreakable Victor Ellison was cracking. The ballroom was stunned into silence. Investors who once trembled at Victor's power now stared wide-eyed as his shoulders sagged, his mighty posture collapsing into something achingly human. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile the ruthless titan with the man now struggling against his own grief. Others watched with a strange kind of reverence, as though they were witnessing a miracle, the fall of arrogance, the birth of truth. The sound of glass tinkling faintly under Liam's forgotten tray seemed like the echo of chains breaking. Victor's empire wasn't collapsing through scandal or financial ruin. It was dissolving because he could no longer deny the ghost of his past, a ghost conjured by the courage of a Maid's son. At last, Victor's voice broke the silence, but it was no longer sharp and commanding. It was hoarse, fragile, trembling. All these years, he whispered, his words barely reaching the ears of those nearest him. I thought if I buried it deep enough, I'd never feel it again. His gray eyes glistened as he turned toward Liam, no longer seeing a servant's child but a mirror of innocence he had lost long ago. A single tear slid down his cheek, shimmering under the golden light. The sight drew gasps from the crowd. For decades, Victor Ellison had ruled through fear, but in that moment, he was ruled by his own humanity. And the boy who had once been invisible had become the one voice powerful enough to bring him to his knees. For a heartbeat, the ballroom remained frozen, guests caught between disbelief and awe, watching the mighty Victor Ellison stand stripped of his arrogance. His shoulders slumped, his hands still trembling as he wiped away the tear that betrayed him. Slowly, painfully, he turned toward Liam. The boy stood small yet unyielding, his brown eyes steady, still clutching the note that had cracked open a fortress of silence. The billionaire who had silenced senators, crushed rivals, and humiliated executives now struggled to find words before a 14-year-old. The irony was not lost on anyone. In that room of power and wealth, it was not Victor's empire that commanded the moment. It was Liam's courage. Victor's voice came out low, raw, stripped of the venom that once laced every syllable. I was wrong, he admitted, his tone trembling. I thought hiding pain would make me stronger, but all it did was make me weaker. His gaze swept over the silent crowd, then fell back on Liam and Sarah. You, he said, pointing not with authority but with something closer to respect, reminded me tonight that truth cannot be buried. And you, his eyes met Sarah's, softening for the first time in decades. You've served me with loyalty I never deserved. The words cracked like thunder across the hall, but this time they carried no arrogance, only humility. Guests leaned in, stunned, as if they had witnessed not just a confession, but a resurrection. Then, before anyone could move, Victor did something no one in that room had ever imagined. He stepped closer to Liam, his towering figure casting a long shadow over the boy, and then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee. The gasp that followed was deafening. A billionaire, a man untouchable in wealth and status, kneeling before the son of a maid. "Forgive me," Victor whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything. For forgetting what matters. For treating people as less than human. Tonight, you showed me what it means to be truly strong." Tears glistened in his eyes, but this time he did not hide them. And as the applause began, hesitant at first but swelling into thunder, Victor Ellison realized that the boy had not humiliated him. He had saved him. The ballroom erupted in applause, not the polite kind reserved for speeches and toasts, but a roar of relief, admiration, and disbelief. Men and women who had spent years pretending to laugh at Victor Ellison's cruelty now clapped until their hands burned, their eyes wide as though witnessing history. Sarah Miller stood motionless, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son transform from invisible servant's boy to the voice that shook an empire. Liam, overwhelmed yet steady, looked at Victor kneeling before him and realized that he had done what no adult, no rival, no power broker had ever dared. He had broken through the armor of arrogance and touched the man beneath. Victor rose slowly, no longer the towering figure of intimidation, but a man humbled, stripped of pretense. He placed a hand on Liam's shoulder, a gesture both fragile and profound, and then turned to face the crowd. "I've spent my life chasing power," he confessed, his voice steady now. "But tonight I was reminded that the greatest power belongs to truth, and to those brave enough to speak it." The audience, once divided between fear and loyalty, now united in thunderous applause. In that moment, the walls of pride that had defined Victor Ellison crumbled, leaving behind a man reborn in front of the very people who once trembled at his name. As the applause continued, Liam stepped back to stand beside his mother, who wrapped her arms around him with pride so fierce it left her breathless. The chandelier lights shimmered like stars above them, but the brightest light in the room came from the courage of a boy who refused to stay silent. Sarah whispered through her tears, "You changed him, Liam. You changed everything." The boy smiled faintly, knowing the truth was finally free. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Together, we'll continue bringing stories that inspire, move, and remind us of the power of truth. Thank you for the support.